Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. We are back looking at the A to Z of PlayStation 1 Hidden Gems, and here we are at the letter V, a letter that I didn't think there'd be that many games for, but in fact there's quite a few. And even some pretty well-known ones like Vandal Hearts, which I didn't include, partly as I didn't really have time to play RPGs, and partly because it's a fairly popular game, and for good reason. Anyway, as always, I've managed to scrape together 10 games starting with the letter V that you may not be aware of. Now, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. Let's kick things off with V2000, a 3D shoot-'em-up where you travel back through different time periods, stopping an evil race of time-travelling bug alien things who are hell-bent on killing off humanity. But let's be honest, can you really blame them? Unfortunately, I haven't played V1 through 1999, but that doesn't seem to matter here, as the game is really all about the action and the shooting rather than a story. The gameplay here is pretty cool though. You're a space shooty bang bang thing from the future, and you get sent back to the past. The natives start off as cavemen, and then as you progress, get more and more modern as you advance through time. Each level sees you put in a medium-sized sandbox level, and these levels are all like tiny planets, and if you go in one direction, you'll eventually end up back where you started, which actually really works well here. Each level has a few objectives. These are usually the same and basically boil down to rescuing civilians and killing any aliens that you see. You have a base on the world, and what you want to do is start off by assessing where the enemies and the civilians are using your radar. Yellow dots are civilians, red ones are aliens. If a certain number of civilians are killed, then it's game over. Then you want to go about rescuing any civilians that are in danger. To start with, your ship can only carry one at a time, but by beaming civilians onto your ship and then taking them back to your base, they're trained up and made into scientists. Get a certain amount of scientists ready, and they'll create new weapons and items for your ship. This is a really cool mechanic, and there's quite a few upgrades you can get, which is always nice. And you're going to need these upgrades, as the game is pretty damn tough. You also need to kill any enemies that you see. These come in the form of mainly giant insects like spiders, ants, maggots, and even some flying dragon things, which are a real pain in the ass. Some fire at you, whereas some just run at you and try to eat you. You get machine guns, lasers, and rockets, to name a few of your weapons. Some of these have unlimited ammo, but not all of them, so you have to explore the levels looking for power-ups like health, fuel, and of course ammo. Now, you don't need fuel just to move around the levels, thankfully. Instead, you need fuel to be able to fly high in the air. This lets you get around more easily as you avoid the bumpy terrain, and it can make taking out the flying enemies easier, but that's never really easy no matter what. The controls here can take a bit to get used to. You press square to go forward and circle to go back, X shoots your weapon, and triangle switches between fly mode and ground mode. The shoulder buttons change weapons. Using the D-pad you can turn and also aim your cannons up and down, so you do have manual control over where you're aiming. It does work, but will definitely take practice. Annoyingly, you have no control over the camera whatsoever. This can make spotting enemies and civilians very tough, and it does also mean it's hard to judge perspective on things, so seeing where enemies actually are in relation to you can be tricky. The graphics are fine, if a little basic. There's some nice effects on the water though, however the frame rate can be awful at times. There's a few enemies on screen at once, then the frame rate will drop to single figures pretty quickly, making combat really tough. And if you die, then it's back to the start screen for you, no matter how far into the game you are. So make sure you save between every level. But not just giving you the option to retry is just so cheap. Overall though, I found that I did keep coming back to this game, as I really liked seeing all the different time periods, and there's something addictive about rescuing people and getting the upgrades. Check this one out if you can handle a little bit of jank. Fighting game time now with the imaginatively named Versus. This 3D one-on-one fighter is all about gangs fighting over their turf, and you've got a surprising amount of characters here. You have 4 gangs: the streets, the beach, the hood, and campus. Each of these gangs has 4 members to choose from that you can play as. Each gang also has 3 stages based on their cliché that you can play on too. So you choose your fighter, and then you do the usual fighting game thing of stepping into an arena and beating the snot out of each other. For your attacks you have a punch, kick, and hard attack, and a block button. Time your blocks correctly and you can do a counter, which is really cool but definitely is hard to do. Hammering the same button over and over does a basic combo, but there's also a load of other moves you can do with all the characters, depending on the directions you press and the combination of buttons. With a bit of practice, you can do some pretty cool looking combos, throws and counters, and you will need the practice because the game does not want to give you a damn chance. When I started playing, the computer just absolutely kicked my ass. The AI is relentless and aggressive and will counter and block most of your moves, and to be honest, this never really changes, it's just that I managed to figure out some cheap ways of winning. Basically, if you use crouch attacks, the computer seems to struggle with blocking them, letting you start a combo, and you basically have to always be aggressive where possible, otherwise the computer will just constantly attack you and you won't have time to breathe. But after I got used to it, the fights actually became pretty fun and tense. There is no option to change the difficulty, so you just have to get good, as the kids say these days. The variety in characters is decent enough too, with wacky over-the-top designs, and I usually prefer that in a fighting game. You get a few game modes, but all of them are just a case of beating everyone up. All that changes is who you fight and how many times, and if you even have a life bar, but that's all to be expected. Graphically, it's a bit of a funny one. It's incredibly blocky, but I actually really like it when older games look like this. The models are pretty detailed though, and there's some cool lighting. Also, the animation is super smooth, and it always runs really well. The controls are responsive, but can be hard to learn, especially for counters and blocking, though I think this is partly because the computer doesn't give you a chance, but there is a training mode, so you can just go there and practice. The sound of music is alright, if a little generic. If you're after a new fighter, then this isn't a bad one to check out. Vanark is a pretty cool 3D shooter that takes more than just a little inspiration from the Star Fox game, though I guess that could just be a coincidence, but yeah, right. It's a space shooter, and you'll never guess what the story is. Yeah, evil alien robot things and innocent creatures that live on a bunch of planets are in need of murdering in the name of justice. Every level here is on rails and lasts around 10 minutes. The levels are actually all really cool. There's normally loads going on in them, and they're usually things like jungles, fire planets, ice planets, and of course you make it into outer space too. Your ship is pretty damn nimble, though criminally you can't do a barrel roll. You've got a standard laser as well as rockets that you have to lock onto enemies with before you can fire them. You can only shoot a couple at a time, but with both weapons you can just hold down the fire button and they'll shoot when needed, which is handy. As mentioned, the enemies are a mixture of wildlife and robots that are basically also in the shape of wildlife, and most of them are really cool, with huge sandworms, dragons, fish and insects being your standard enemies, and then the bosses tend to be even bigger variations of these. In fact, some of the bosses here are really fun to fight, having the classic enemy patterns for you to learn and some massive attacks that will wipe you out in just a few hits. Interestingly, between levels you get to explore your base. Here you can talk with the rest of your crew and build up relationships with them. They'll give you hints and advice about what's coming up, and each crew member has their own strengths and weaknesses. What's even more interesting is that you can choose a wingman for each mission, and depending on who you choose, the level plays slightly differently. Some of the characters are all about combat, so they'll take you on a route with more enemies and will help you deal more damage. One of the characters is a spy who's been scouting out the enemy bases, so they'll take you on different routes that are often shorter or have less enemies in them if you have them as your wingman. This is a really cool idea and it works nicely, though you never actually see your wingman other than in cutscenes. But back on your base, you'll meet new people and chat with them, and that's how you unlock them as wingmen, or wingwomen I suppose. Here you can also go on a training mission as often as you'd like if you want to brush up your skills, and you can even upgrade and swap your loadout with more weapons coming available as you progress. While this is all good, I did find that I got a bit sick of having to wander around the base, basically just having to go into every room and speak to every person before the next mission. It doesn't really add much to the game and it just drags it out. Not that this is a long game, I was playing for about 2 hours and I'm pretty sure I was on the last mission. Graphically, the game is pretty good. I really like the flying levels, and these are all super smooth, and I love the designs of enemies, and even your knockoff R-Wing. It all looks great. The character models and stuff like that in the base though are all kinda wonky. It looks very stiff and just not that good. The CGI cutscenes are impressive though. The controls here are spot on, using analog stick for the flying missions is perfect and incredibly responsive, just as it should be. I had a blast playing this one, and I think you might too. Time for some spooky shit now with Vampire Hunter D, based on the anime. That I've actually seen, and it's pretty damn good. The story here isn't the most in-depth, but it does the job. A rich man's daughter has been kidnapped and you're offered a ton of money to go get her back. To be honest, that's really all you need, but of course it does get more in-depth as you play, as the man's son has also hired a bunch of vampire hunters that you'll be competing with. Some are kinda friendly, but of course some want that money all for themselves and will do what they can to stop you. The game plays like a mix of Resident Evil and a very early version of Devil May Cry, and I'm honestly quite surprised at how well it all works. It's a 3D action game, as you've seen by now, with a fixed camera. You have to explore a pretty large mansion filled with monsters, puzzles and secrets galore, and you do the usual thing of finding items and pushing things around so you can find keys and open up new areas of the castle. What makes this more of an action game than a survival horror though is the combat and movement. The game still uses tank controls, but they're much faster and more responsive. You also have a jump button, meaning there's some light platforming here, but never anything too major. And the combat is mostly melee, with your sword being a primary means of attack. You have some basic combos, but will learn more moves as you go. Also, you have a bunch of magic spells you can use. These come in a few varieties. You've got attacks like fireballs and magic homing missile things, and you also have defensive ones that give you shields, and you can even heal yourself. And this is a big thing. You'll be relying on your healing spell more than items you find. Using your spells consumes your VP, and of course to get it back you have to drain enemies. This is another cool mechanic. Basically, when you're fighting enemies, at some point you'll flash red. This happens at different times depending on how tough the enemies are, but you'll learn when to use it when it happens with each one. When it does, you'll want to hold down the square button. This lets you drain the life force from an enemy and replenishes your magic points. But you have to be careful, as when doing this, it leaves you wide open to attack. So, really, you want to do it when there's only 1 or 2 enemies around, otherwise the combat can be pretty damn tough. Also, with the game having fixed camera angles, that can make it hard, as you can't see enemies that are around corners, and they'll often just appear out of nowhere and attack you before you get a chance to swing your sword. And the fixed camera angle also makes it hard to judge how far they are away from you, so I would often just swing in the air and then take a few hits, which was annoying. But something you don't see often, and that I really love, is that you can save your progress at any point from the pause menu. This is not a feature that's very common in games like this, but it really helps it not be frustrating, so just as long as you save often, you don't have to replay hours of progress when you die. As you play, you'll find a load of items as well. These come in the form of healing items, as well as weapons like bombs or wooden stakes that you need for some of the tougher areas. What's cool is that you have healing items, and you can also use these on other characters you meet in order to rescue them, but you don't have to if you want to be a bastard. The game looks decent with some good looking characters and pre-rendered environments, and of course most of the cutscenes are from the anime. What's good here is that the puzzles aren't over cryptic, and they're actually quite simple, but in a way that keeps the game flowing rather than having you run around aimlessly for ages, though it can be easy to get lost as the environments are huge. Thankfully you do find a map as you go, but I do wish there was a button that went straight to it instead of having to go through your inventory every time. But even with these small annoyances, this is a really solid game, and probably a lot better than most people would expect, including me. Definitely check this one out if you can. If you want to get wet, then maybe the generically named VR Sports Powerboat Racing will be for you. It's exactly that, a powerboat racing game. You select from a number of powerboats that may or may not be based on real ones. That's really not my forte. And then you choose from a few cups, all of which will be featuring locations that are real places, like the UK, America and Brazil. And you do some exciting high-speed races while landmark spotting. It's fun. Now, this is definitely a budget game, and you can really tell, as it's pretty bare bones in terms of content, presentation, and just about everything, but it is functional and does what it sets out to do reasonably well. When you're selecting your craft, you're not given any stats for them, which is kind of strange, especially as they all do play quite differently, with the handling and speed being noticeably different between a lot of them. But to start with, you're likely to just choose the one that looks the coolest. And then you choose your course and aim to get the most points by the end of a series of races. The actual courses themselves are pretty good. They're wide enough to get a few people in them at once, which isn't always the case with some of these games. Sometimes their narrow tracks are barely giving you enough space for a single person to get past, so it's nice to be able to weave around a bit. There's also quite a lot going on in them. You get a decent variety of locales, and they do all look good enough. The pop-up isn't too bad, and you can always see quite far ahead, so you know which way to go, and you do also have a handy dandy map. What's also nice is that in some of the courses, the route changes on each lap, and I always appreciate it when games do this sort of thing. It helps keep you on your toes. There's jumps and obstacles all over the place too, for you to leap off or just avoid. When you're in the air, you can use the shoulder buttons to adjust the angle of your ship, so you can either land softly or go underwater for a bit, though going underwater isn't recommended as it really slows you down, and you never actually have to go under anything. In fact, you can actually change your pitch at any point, depending on the waves. This can adjust your speed, so get practicing with it early on. The controls here are decent enough. It's a water racing game, and the physics can be a little wonky and floaty, but for the most part it all seems to work kinda well. It also looks good enough, though you do get a bit of slowdown when there's a few races on screen at once. I actually didn't really like this one when I first started playing, especially as the camera is positioned annoyingly low and I couldn't find a way to change it other than being first person view, which I don't really like in racing games. It just feels strange. But once I was used to that and I got the hang of the physics, it actually turned out to be a surprisingly fun little racing game. Vehicle Cavalier is a Japan-only mech game that has a story, but I don't really know what it's about. Though, at a guess, it's your usual bad guy mech people are being naughty, so good guy mech people have to go and give them a slap. Now, there's a lot of menus and talky bits in this game, but it actually doesn't get in the way of playing it, and I did manage to figure everything out pretty easily. From your main menus, you've got a few options. You can go to the shop where you can buy a load of new weapons for your mech. Again, it was fairly easy to figure out what all of these were and what they did just from the images shown, even though I couldn't read it, and I just assumed the more expensive they were, the more powerful. Then you have a bit where you can equip your mech with the weapons and things you've bought. What's interesting is that you can assign each weapon to a different button on the controller, and you can have multiple weapons on one button, so you can actually have all 4 weapons equipped at one time, and if you want, you can have them all set to the same attack button, making combat very easy, which I kinda liked. Each weapon does have a cooldown though, so you won't be constantly firing, and they do have to take your finger off the button and press it again to use the weapon once it's recharged. The only thing that will constantly fire is your machine gun. You can also customise the colour of your mech, though I never bothered with that. You of course have your normal missions where you'll be given a briefing, but pretty much every mission is just a case of blow everything up. There's enemy mechs and bases and you need to destroy them all to beat a level. It kind of plays like virtual on games when you're in the missions, when you're in a medium-sized arena and a map that shows you where everything you need to destroy is. Then you just need to get your circle strafe on and take out the fools. I actually found the game quite easy, and so far I haven't lost a level. Of course, taking time to upgrade your mech between levels is essential. More and more missions will unlock as you play, over new terrain and with tougher enemies. You also have what I think are training or just bonus fights, which are one-on-one battles against a single tougher opponent, and you get prize money for beating them. These are fun and a good way to train as well. Graphically, the game isn't particularly good. The battles all look pretty blurry and the enemies are pretty hard to make out what they are. Even your mech looks kinda crappy and the levels are kinda bland and lifeless, but the controls are smooth and the combat is addictive. Opening up new levels and getting more powerful weapons is always fun. This is another one that's more substance than style, but it can be a fun game to play. Here is Vib Ribbon, an interesting rhythm game that is very simple, but like all good rhythm games, it doesn't take long before it gets pretty damn challenging. So yeah, here you initially choose from one of 3 difficulties, and each of these difficulties has a couple of tracks for you to play through. You play as a cool looking wireframe thing, a sort of frog rabbit creature, and he's cool. He walks along a line and various obstacles appear on that line, depending on what it is if you press one of 4 buttons, either L, R, triangle or up on the D-pad. Not sure why they went with these buttons, but it works and actually feels right when you're playing. If there's a Sonic style loop, then you want to press the R button. If there's a block to jump over, you press L. If there's a hole in the ground, you press the D-pad up, and if there's spikes on the ground, you press triangle. Simple. The speed of the track determines the speed of the obstacles coming at you, and this of course is where most of the challenge comes in. But in the upper difficulties, these obstacles are combined, so you might see a loop with spikes in it, which means you have to press R and triangle at the same time. Or there might be a tall block with a hole in it, so you press L and up at the same time. It gets very confusing, and the game never reminds you of the buttons you need to press, so you really need to learn it. For every one you get right, you get a little dot around you. These dots go completely around you, and then you transform into a bigger creature. If you miss too many, then you transform into a smaller creature until you become a weird worm thing. Miss too many here, and it's game over. On the harder tracks, you'll be transforming a lot. The default tracks here are very Japanese, and I kinda like them. However, the main draw is that you can actually use your own music CDs with the game, and it builds the level around the tracks themselves, kind of like an interactive equalizer. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you this because, of course, the video would get a copyright claim, and totally not because I'm emulating it and I don't know how to use my own music with it. But the fact that you can do this is a really cool option to have, and it makes it have unlimited replay value, assuming you still have CDs, I suppose. I really like the simple graphics, they work very well and have a charm to them, and the controls, they're fine. You do have to be very precise with your button presses, but if you have rhythm, then you should be alright. Overall, this may be a little too niche, as you do need a physical copy of the game and a selection of CDs to really enjoy it, but it is still worth playing any way you can, just to see some wacky rhythm gameplay. Viewpoint is a stupid name for a game, but for some reason they went with it, so here we are. Viewpoint is an isometric shooter that doesn't really bother with anything story-wise, but my guess is that it'll be the same as just about any of these types of games. The gameplay is what we really care about though, and here, it's fine. It's a shooter, so of course you're constantly scrolling up the screen in an isometric fashion, and waves of enemies and obstacles will come your way. You've got a few weapons to fight back with. You've got your standard shot, which is decent enough against most enemies. You can hammer the button for rapid fire, or if you hold it down you can charge it up, and when you release it there's a devastating charge shot that will destroy most enemies in one hit, and even go through a lot of the smaller ones, letting you take out a row in one go. As well as this, you can collect an option, which gives you an extra shot on either side of you. These also shoot standard shots, giving you a much wider range. Also, the options will absorb enemy shots, and are essential in surviving as there's a ton of enemy bullets on screen most of the time here. You'd also get a selection of bombs. There's a flame wall, a homing mine, and one that just explodes a lot, though these all basically do the same thing, but they are very good against bosses and most enemies. But boy, this is a tough game. The enemies themselves are kinda difficult to kill for a few reasons. Partly it's because there's loads of them, and most of them are on screen at the same time. Some of them just move around erratically, some shoot at you, and there's some that head straight towards you. Also, you can only take one hit and you're dead, and rather than coming back where you left off, you go back to a checkpoint, and these are few and far between. Thankfully, there is always one near the boss. You also only get a handful of lives before it's game over. As well as the tough enemies, which take quite a few hits, the levels also have hazards in them, like walls that move around and appear out of nowhere, fences you got to shoot down, or sometimes even levels that need to be pressed by shooting at them. If you touch anything, you die, and you often won't know what you're meant to do the first time you see a new obstacle. One saving grace is that there are loads of passwords, and the passwords are only 3 characters long, so it's easy to get back to where you left off. Though the loading that happens when you die is a real pain in the ass, especially as you can easily die just a few seconds after spawning, and it takes longer to load than you actually live for. I did find a couple of shield power-ups which helped a bit, but they barely lasted. Ironically, or maybe the whole point of the name, is that the viewpoint is actually what makes this game so hard, I think. It's really tough to judge where you are in conjunction with the enemies and their bullets. It also makes shooting them tough, as it's hard to line yourself up with them. Basically, the game is fucking hard, and I only managed to get to the 3rd level. The graphics here are alright, they're all pre-rendered, but I do have some issues with a lot of the enemies, mainly the fact that I'm like, what the hell are they? They're just random shapes. Like, what's the spinning discs with a dot meant to be? What are the random slinky cube things? It is just so random. Some of the later enemies do make more sense, being animal related, but it just looks like they've taken stock sprites from somewhere and thrown them in the game. The music is pretty damn good though, with a cool techno soundtrack, so that's good. If you're into shooters and want a challenge, then I would say this is worth giving a go. Virtual Pro Wrestling is another Japan-only game, and is actually a very early version of what would eventually become the beloved WCW and even WWF games on the Nintendo 64, and it's something you can really see here. So yeah, it's a wrestling game, and it's one with a ton of options that are all in Japanese, but feature your single matches, championships, tag teams, etc, etc. You get a ton of characters to choose from, most of which I'm not familiar with as they're Japanese ones, but there are a few that I recognised, like Sting and Ric Flair, though I'm not entirely sure if it's actually them or if they're just lookalikes. Either way, it doesn't matter, as every character is pretty fun to play as. The actual wrestling is very solid here, and while it's not quite up to the standards of the later WCW games, it's still a lot of fun. You've got your standard punches and kicks, and holding down the button does different moves, and you also have a dedicated hard attack button. Pressing different directions also does a few different attacks. In all, there's a surprising amount here. And then there's the grapples. You've got a grab button, and tapping it does a light grab, and depending on the direction you're pressing when you tap it, you do a different move. You can also hold down the grapple button for a harder grab, which does more powerful moves, but is much slower, and these are actually very hard to pull off. When an opponent is on the ground, you can do a range of attacks and submission moves, and you can throw them into the ropes or corners for even bigger attacks. Really, the range of moves you can do is very impressive. Blocks and counters are also very important here, and you'll want to do as much reversing as you can, as the computer is pretty damn tough to fight. They'll counter a lot of your moves, and I found that doing hard attacks was tricky, as they just get up straight after being knocked down, or they just wouldn't be stunned long enough to use one. For me, the best tactic was to use submission attacks. Instead of a health bar, you've got a spirit bar, which changes depending on how well you're fighting. The better your spirit, the easier it is for you to counter and reverse moves, and you're also even a little faster too. It also determines how long you're stunned for, and how long it takes you to break out of holds. You can taunt your enemies, which is a good way of getting some of your spirit back. The graphics here are surprisingly good. You can easily see all the polygons that make up each character, but they look decent and animate really well. In fact, I'd say that this is actually better looking than some of the N64 ones. The controls are good, but you will definitely need to practice to learn how to do all the moves and how to drag your opponent around the ring like you need to, but it is loads of fun to play. I really enjoy a good wrestling game, and this one is definitely that. Check it out if you like people in pants slapping each other. And finally for today, here is Virus, It Is Aware. This is an action survival horror game which is based on a comic by Dark Horse Comics. It's about a ship that was infected with an alien virus that arrives in Japan and infects the Nakomi Hotel. That's right, the Nakomi Hotel. I'm sure I've heard that somewhere before. You play as the excitingly named grandmother Joan, a policewoman sent in to help rescue everyone that might be trapped inside, as monsters have taken over the place and it keeps randomly exploding. So you start in the sewers, because why wouldn't you, and you make your way up through the hotel, fending off hundreds of horrid mutated people who have turned into alien monster things. It's kind of like a very early Dead Space. No, it isn't. The levels aren't particularly complicated, and really it's just a case of getting into each room, clearing it of enemies, finding switches to push, and then repeating. But that's alright, I kind of like it, even though it is pretty basic and janky. As you get further into the hotel, things start to get more interesting, with more populated areas and even some more scenery that isn't just a basic room with a table in it. In fact, you'll come across survivors who you need to rescue. This is often easier said than done though, as they're pretty damn useless, and just stay in one place letting themselves be attacked. If they die, it's game over. There's no checkpoints here either, so if you haven't saved at the end of every level, it's back to the start of the game for you. You do have a few weapons though. You start with a couple of pistols. Your first one has unlimited ammo, though of course is kind of weak. And then you also have a stronger pistol that does have limited ammo, but does more damage. And you find more weapons along the way. You also have a taser that you can use, which has to recharge, but it's pretty handy in a fight, and stuns most enemies for a few seconds, letting you get a bit of breathing room. And there's loads of enemies here. You'll often be fighting 3 or 4 at a time, and dozens will spawn into one room. So shooting and stunning them is essential. Thankfully, the enemies are all dumb as hell, and literally just run at you, or if they do shoot a projectile, they normally just stay in one place and attack. Basically here, as long as you keep moving, you'll be alright, though it can be easy to get surrounded. You can circle strafe by holding L1, but strangely, while you're doing this, you can't move backwards, which is very annoying. You can only strafe while moving forwards, or of course side to side. But you do get used to it, and thanks to a very generous auto-aim, it's all quite manageable. You also have a few characters that help out on most levels. They'll follow you and will actually do a half-decent job of attacking and killing enemies, which is nice. They'll even give you health and certain items at different points of the levels, and this is good as there's no health pickups at all during levels. You only get your health back at certain parts of the stage or at the start of a new mission. though none of them are that long, so it's doable. Something that is annoying though is that there's random explosions and things that happen all the time, and you've got no way to avoid these and no way of knowing that they're even about to happen. It's just a really cheap way of taking damage. The graphics here are pretty crappy, to be honest. It all looks very basic and cheap. The characters are all very angular and sometimes don't even animate, just sliding towards you, which looks very silly. The controls are responsive, they just needed a bit of refinement, but thanks for the auto aim, it is generally okay. Overall, this is one of those games that's kinda crappy, but it has a charm to it. I genuinely had fun with it, and its hammy plot and obvious Die Hard parallels. It's basically Die Hard with an alien virus. Check this one out if you want a bit of silly action. So there you go, 10 PlayStation 1 Hidden Gems, starting with the letter V. Which ones have you played? Let us know in the comments below, and of course, tell me how stupid I am for not including Vandal Hearts. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.